He didn't cast spells, he didn't summon demons, but he killed more so-called witches than anyone in history, and made a fortune doing it. For 3 years, Matthew Hopkins turned fear into blood, all while hiding one terrifying truth. He was the real monster. So how did an unqualified man use God, fear, and a needle to unleash mass hysteria? And what finally stopped him? These are the twisted truths behind why the Witchfinder general was worse than any witch. In the chaos of 1640s England, while the Civil War raged and religious paranoia peaked, one obscure man, Matthew Hopkins, saw an opportunity. He took it with both hands and forged a title that would make him famous and feared. Picture England torn apart. Brother fought brother. The king was at war with Parliament. Churches split down the middle. When the world feels like it's ending, people desperately want someone, anyone, to promise salvation. Hopkins gave them exactly what they craved, certainty in uncertain times. He wasn't born to power. Most likely the son of a small-town lawyer, Hopkins had watched greater men rise while he remained nobody special. But chaos creates cracks, and ambitious men slip through them. When traditional authority crumbled, Hopkins simply stepped into the void and announced he was now in charge of finding witches. The title, Witchfinder General, sounds official, doesn't it? Like something stamped by Parliament or blessed by bishops. But Hopkins invented it himself. Think about that audacity. One morning, he was just another face in the crowd. By afternoon, he'd crowned himself England's chief witch hunter, and somehow, incredibly, people believed him. The Puritan movement had primed England like kindling, waiting for a spark. They saw Satan's hand in every misfortune, failed crops, sick children, sudden deaths. When your neighbor's cow dies and yours lives, someone must be practicing dark magic. When the old woman down the lane mutters under her breath, she's obviously casting spells. Fear had already done the heavy lifting. Hopkins just gave that fear a name and a face. But his authority wasn't earned. You'll see why that mattered later. But titles were just the beginning. It's what he did with them, using pins, ropes, and sleepless nights, that made him terrifying. What if your entire life could be ruined by a mark on your skin? Or worse, the lack of one. Hopkins didn't rely on witchcraft to convict people. He used a toolkit of pain and pseudoscience that would make a torturer blush. First came the devil's mark inspection. Hopkins claimed every witch bore Satan's mark, a spot where the devil had touched them that felt no pain. Sounds reasonable until you realize his method. He'd strip suspects naked in front of crowds, then probe every mole, scar, and blemish with a sharp needle. But here's the twisted genius. Hopkins used special needles with retractable points. When he wanted to prove guilt, the needle would appear to penetrate skin without causing pain or drawing blood. The crowd saw a miracle. The victim saw a fraud. But who would believe the accused witch over God's chosen instrument? The swimming test was even crueler. They'd bind the suspect's hands and feet, then throw them into deep water. If you sank and drowned, congratulations. You were innocent. If you somehow managed to float, you were clearly a witch who'd made a pact with Satan to save your life. Either way, you probably died. Hopkins had created the perfect trap. Heads I win, tails you lose. But perhaps most diabolical was what he called watching. Hopkins would force suspects to sit upright for days without sleep, often with their arms stretched out in painful positions. No food, no water, no rest. Just guards taking shifts to ensure the accused never closed their eyes. After 72 hours of this torture, most people would confess to anything, flying to Sabbaths, consorting with demons, cursing their neighbors' livestock. Sleep deprivation breaks minds faster than any rack or Iron Maiden. And Hopkins documented everything. He turned torture into paperwork, making it look scientific and holy. Each scream became evidence. Every forced confession became testimony. Pain transformed into proof of God's justice. These weren't random acts of cruelty. This was systematic, methodical destruction of human beings disguised as religious procedure. Hopkins had weaponized fear and wrapped it in the language of salvation. We'll come back to how women bore the worst of this. And none of this had legal precedent. That's what makes the next part even more shocking. How does someone with no official power get entire towns to hang their neighbors? During the English Civil War, the legal system broke down completely. Judges fled. Courts closed. Local magistrates found themselves making life and death decisions without guidance or oversight. Into this vacuum stepped Matthew Hopkins, offering simple solutions to complex fears. Think of him as a medieval con artist with a briefcase full of death. He'd arrive in town like a traveling salesman, except his product was the promise of cleansing evil from your community. And business was booming. Hopkins charged substantial fees, sometimes more than £20 per town, equivalent to thousands today. But terrified communities paid gladly. What price could you put on driving Satan from your streets? He made witch hunting profitable, turning fear into his personal gold mine. His methods were brilliantly manipulative. Hopkins never forced himself on communities. Instead, he waited for invitations. When mysterious deaths occurred or crops failed, town leaders would send desperate letters begging the famous Witchfinder general to save them. By the time Hopkins arrived, the town had already convicted itself of harboring evil. He simply provided the theatrical finale. He understood that fear needs validation. Local magistrates, mostly untrained in law and drowning in religious paranoia, desperately wanted someone to tell them they were doing God's work. Hopkins gave them that permission. He'd nod gravely at their suspicions, confirm their worst fears, then guide them through the process of legal murder. The genius was in the shared responsibility. Hopkins never acted alone. He convinced entire communities to participate in the killing. Town officials signed warrants, citizens testified against neighbors, juries delivered verdicts. Everyone had blood on their hands, which meant everyone was invested in believing they had done right. Hopkins moved through East Anglia like a plague, leaving bodies in his wake. Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, Cambridgeshire, entire regions fell under his influence. In 3 years, he orchestrated more executions than England had seen in the previous century of witch trials combined. These weren't random victims. Most were women. We'll explain why next. And here's the cruelest irony. The very people most likely to be accused were the ones least able to fight back. Why were witches so often women? And why were they always the ones no one listened to? Hopkins didn't just prosecute witches. He preyed on the powerless. Look at his victim list, and a pattern emerges as clear as blood on snow. Most were poor, widowed, or elderly women. To them, Hopkins simply gave that fear a weapon. In Puritan theology, women were weaker vessels, more susceptible to Satan's temptation. Eve had led Adam astray, hadn't she? Women were naturally closer to sin, more likely to traffic with demons. This wasn't Hopkins' invention. He just exploited centuries of misogyny wrapped in religious doctrine. His typical targets: the widow who lived alone and mumbled to herself, the midwife whose patient sometimes died in childbirth, the herbalist who knew which plants could heal or harm, the elderly woman who kept cats and talked to them like children. These women had always made communities nervous. Hopkins transformed that nervousness into death sentences. Take Elizabeth Clark, his first major victim, an elderly, one-legged widow who lived in poverty in Manningtree. When Hopkins moved to town, neighbors suddenly remembered every strange thing about her. The way she talked to her animals, how she'd cursed when children threw stones at her door, the fact that several people had died after arguments with her. None of this proved witchcraft, but it didn't need to. Hopkins made suspicion into evidence. Under his torture, Clark confessed to consorting with demons named Holt, Jarmara, Vinegar Tom, and Saki and Sugar. She implicated other women, who under their own torture named still more. Hopkins had created a cascade of accusations that swept through communities like wildfire. Anne west of Lawford was another typical victim, a poor woman who begged for food and cursed those who refused her. When a farmer's pig died after he'd turned her away hungry, West was marked for death. Hopkins' needles found her devil's mark. His watching broke her will. His swimming test condemned her soul. The cruelest detail? That devil's mark test we mentioned earlier was often performed in public, on naked, humiliated women. Hopkins stripped away not just their clothes, but their dignity, their privacy, their basic humanity. Then he invited crowds to watch as he probed their bodies with his fake needles, searching for spots that wouldn't bleed or hurt. These women had no lawyers, no advocates, no powerful families to protect them. They faced Hopkins alone, old, poor, and terrified. When they screamed under torture, he called it confession. When they maintained innocence, he called it Satan's stubbornness. There was no way to win, no path to survival. But here's the twist. For all his holy talk, Hopkins had no training, no license, no doctrine, just ambition. How did a man with no legal or religious training become the most feared figure in England? The answer reveals everything about Hopkins' true nature. He wasn't a scholar, he wasn't a priest. He was a performer, a master manipulator who used fear, showmanship, and Puritan buzzwords to convince towns he was righteous. Hopkins had likely started studying law, but never finished. Some accounts suggest he'd considered the ministry, but lacked the education. By all accounts, he was a failed man, nursing wounded ambitions, when the Civil War handed him his opportunity. But failure taught him something valuable. People want to believe in authority more than they want to question it. His genius lay in understanding his audience. Puritan communities craved certainty in an uncertain world. They wanted someone to stand up and declare with absolute confidence that evil was real, identifiable, and defeatable. Hopkins gave them exactly that performance. Watch him work and you'd see pure theater. He'd arrive in towns wearing his self-appointed authority like expensive clothes. He'd speak in the language of biblical prophecy mixed with legal-sounding procedures. He'd nod gravely at local fears, quote scripture selectively, and promise swift justice against Satan's servants. Hopkins never claimed supernatural powers himself. That would have made him suspect. Instead, he positioned himself as God's detective, using holy wisdom to uncover unholy truths. He was Sherlock Holmes with a Bible, CSI with a cross. People didn't need to believe in his magic, just his mission. The scariest part? Hopkins probably believed his own performance. Somewhere along the way, the fraud became the fanatic. He'd convinced himself that his invented authority was divine calling, that his torture techniques were holy procedures, that his victims' screams were demons fleeing their hosts. He'd created a feedback loop of validation. Towns paid him, which proved his value. Magistrates followed his lead, which confirmed his authority. Victims confessed under torture, which validated his methods. Success bred success until Hopkins was no longer pretending to be God's Witchfinder. He genuinely believed he was. That certainty led to 300 deaths in just 3 years. An average of 2 people per week, every week, for 156 weeks straight. Each one tortured, humiliated, and killed by a man with no more authority than the hat on his head and the fear in people's hearts. And then, suddenly, he disappeared. But not before rumors began to swirl. Why did the man who condemned hundreds suddenly vanish, without trial, without revenge? In 1647, Matthew Hopkins retired abruptly from public life. The great Witchfinder general simply stopped finding witches. Some say he died of tuberculosis. Others whisper poetic justice, that he was accused of witchcraft himself. The official story claims consumption took him, a wasting disease that slowly drained his life like he drained so many others. He died quietly in his bed, they say. Just another forgotten man in a forgotten grave. But England doesn't forget men like Hopkins easily, and the whispers tell a different tale. According to legend, Hopkins faced his own swimming test. The story goes that suspicious townsfolk finally turned his methods against him. They bound his hands and feet just as he'd done to hundreds of women. They threw him into deep water to see if he would sink or swim. And when he floated, as any man might when fighting for his life, they declared him a witch and executed him. It's probably just a story, a tale too perfectly ironic to be true, but it reveals something important about how Hopkins was remembered. People wanted to believe that justice had found him in the end, that the hunter had become the hunted, that God's justice was more reliable than man's. The truth is likely more mundane and somehow more chilling. Hopkins probably did die of disease, having escaped earthly punishment for his crimes. No court ever tried him. No victim ever confronted him. No authority ever stripped away his invented title or questioned his methods. He simply faded away, leaving behind only blood on parchment and memories that never faded. But his legacy lived on in ways he never imagined. Hopkins became a character in horror stories, a figure of dread who stalked through British folklore like the very demons he claimed to fight. Writers turned him into literature. Filmmakers made him into nightmares. The man who exploited fear became a legend of fear himself. In the end, Matthew Hopkins proved something terrifying about human nature. Given enough fear and the right circumstances, ordinary people will follow anyone who promises simple answers to complex problems. They'll participate in murder if you call it justice. They'll torture innocents if you call it God's work. They'll abandon their humanity if you give them permission to feel righteous while doing it. Hopkins killed over 300 people without magic, without supernatural powers, without anything more than ambition and a talent for reading human weakness. He was worse than any witch because the evil he unleashed was entirely human. And that's the most frightening truth of all.